Welcome to episode 1 of the Tom Schimmer podcast. Finally, after a couple of months of planning and a few weeks of podcast hype, episode 1 is finally here. Again, thanks for giving this new podcast a listen. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and rate the podcast, as it's my goal to produce a podcast each week that is both informative and enjoyable. And I'm always open to your feedback, your input, your suggestions, maybe for interview guests or possible segments, and how to generally improve the podcast. So you can either tweet me personally, my handle is @TomSchimmer, or the show's Twitter handle, which is @TomSchimmerPod. You can also email me, and the email for the show, of course, is tomschimmerpod@gmail.com, and I would look forward to your suggestions. I am fired up for today's pod, not just because it's episode 1, but because I've got Tom Guskey in the interview. After Tom, we're going to have In the News. That's going to include a story out of Utah about COVID testing protocols for teachers and school staff, as well as recent news stories that have come out of the province of Alberta about their new guiding vision for K-12 education. Assessment Corner is going to include a question about large-scale assessment and how large-scale assessment can be used to improve student learning, and also a question about feedback. And of course, we'll finish up today's pod with Tweets of the Week, where I'll have a couple of really great follow suggestions for you. So we've got a ton to get to today, so let's get to it. Okay, we'll have my interview with Tom Guskey coming up in a few moments. But first, don't at me. But I've got something to say about how we approach the reopening of schools this fall, and that is we have to find our balance. Now, I know what you're thinking. Way to come out hard and definitive on episode 1, Tom. But honestly, coming up the middle these days seems to leave you open to critique on both sides of an issue. Especially today on social media, where many seem to be so absolute and unwavering. Now, as I reflect on my own experience over the last 6 months, I suspect what has emerged in many places is that we are living in parallel realities that are actually challenging to reconcile. There is this conflict between the pandemic as it's described to us versus how the pandemic is being experienced. Now, I'm not suggesting either is wrong, but they are different, and they are eliciting very different reactions. Now, back in 2009, on the heels of the worst recession the world had seen in almost a century, Ralph Hertwig and Ido Erev wrote about the description, experience, gap, and risky choice. And I think that research is quite relevant today. I mean, after all, there is a risk with reopening schools. As we look back at the recession and the housing crash, especially with what happened in the United States, many people made some risky mortgage decisions, and financial institutions allowed them to make those risky decisions. So the overarching question would be, why? Why were they allowed to make those decisions, and why did financial institutions permit that? Well, Hertwig and Erev suspect that the financial industry failed to account for what they call an unexpected and unpredictable rare events. Now, it's interesting to think about how many times we might do this as we weigh the risk of any decision we are faced with. So a lot of times we'll think, well, okay, there is a risk, but what really are the chances of that rarest event occurring? Like, even think about rental cars. Do you get the insurance? Well, on the one hand, you would say, well, I have to get the insurance because you never know what can happen. But then think about how many times you've paid for the insurance and nothing has actually happened. You just thought that was money down the drain. So Hertwig and Erev summarize the research about the description experience gap this way. They say that in decisions that are made from experience, people behave as if rare events have less impact than they deserve according to objective probabilities. So in the rental car example, if you only base the decision of the insurance on your experience, then you're for sure going to tell yourself you don't need it. But in decisions that are made from descriptions, people behave as if rare events have more impact than they deserve. So again, in the rental car example, if you listen long enough to descriptions of the risks associated with not getting the insurance, you're getting the insurance. So this is the dilemma. The way the pandemic is being described to us and the way we are experiencing it are two different things. So let's talk about those parallels. First, let's talk about the descriptions. So if you were to only judge the risk of reopening schools on how COVID is being described, especially on the news, then it's likely you would give a disproportionate amount of weight to the risk of contracting COVID. Now, this is not some rant about mainstream media or anything like that. But it is important at least to be mindful that most media are dependent upon advertising dollars, Advertisers like eyes and ears, so the media, and look, this is not a new thing, will do anything it can to play up rare events, whether that rare event be a storm, a financial crisis, or even, yes, a pandemic. That gets viewers and listeners, which increases ratings, which is what most media outlets use to set advertising prices. That's why a Super Bowl ad is so expensive. Now, I'm not suggesting the media is not reporting facts. They absolutely are. But there are choices that could be made to help keep things in perspective. The one thing I have never seen in my lifetime is that little ticker on the side of the screen keeping a running tally of every case. It makes me wonder how we would have reacted all these years if every winter we had an influenza ticker at the bottom of the screen. Now, I understand that this is a novel virus and that fear of the unknown really shocked our systems back in February, March, and April. But it's not February, March, and April anymore. Is it good to be informed? Of course. But being inundated with description after description after description of the risks associated with this pandemic is likely to result in many of us overestimating the risks associated with going about our daily lives. So if we only made decisions about schools based on how COVID is described, then it's likely we would favor a full remote learning model because we would say to ourselves, look, the risk is just too high. But now let's think about how we've experienced COVID. I've not had any firsthand experience with COVID. No one in my immediate family or even my extended family has. Many of us have been tested, but no positives have come back, nor have any of my friends. Now, I wear my mask, I keep my physical distance, and I clean my hands incessantly. Now, that said, I shouldn't be all that surprised that COVID hasn't entered my sphere because, according to the World Health Organization, only 2% of the total U.S. population and only 0.37% of Canada's population have even contracted the disease at all. So the truth is the vast majority of people have not contracted COVID. Now, maybe that's a have not yet contracted COVID, but I don't know that. So on the one hand, we say 6 million cases in the United States, 140,000 in Canada. Of course, the United States has 10 times the population. Those raw numbers are real, and they are serious, and I'm not trying to downplay them. But when you look at active cases, or you talk about it in terms of percentage of population, it actually sounds different, doesn't it? Anyway, what does this all mean? Well, it means we have to balance ourselves, if not for our own sanity, but for the sake of our students as well. I mean, if we live only from description, you'll likely overweight the risks, thereby overly stressing yourself out about the entirety of the situation, which means you won't be at your best, both for yourself and for your students. So if you live only from experience, you'll do the opposite. You'll likely underweight the risks and maybe even become a little complacent because, after all, what are the odds, right? The answer for me is balance. Behave enough from description to stay on guard. Now, I've talked to several teachers who tell me, especially those who are in face-to-face situations, that the physical distancing, the masks, etc., it's challenging because being back at work feels normal, even though there is little that is normal about the fall of 2020. This virus is real, it's highly contagious, and while therapeutics are improving, it is still a pandemic that cannot be treated lightly. At the same time, we need to behave enough from experience to know that if you are following the big three, that is wearing your mask, keeping your physical distancing, and washing your hands, that you reduce your risks and the vast majority of people will either not contract COVID or will recover. Now, schools are part of the fabric of society, and while schools are not simply childcare services, we know that, they are part of a social contract that allows parents to resume their careers. They allow teachers to resume their careers. And not everyone has the job security or even the opportunity to work from home. Business owners can't just simply close their businesses indefinitely, and we know healthcare professionals can't work from home. The easiest thing to predict is the absolute worst case scenario. Why? Well, because as Teresa Amabile described way back in 1983, quote, only pessimism sounds profound. Optimism sounds superficial. And second, you know what else is not going to happen? No one will call you out for being wrong in predicting the worst case scenario because everybody's going to be so ecstatic that the worst case scenario didn't happen. No one's coming back at you saying, hey, I thought you said this was going to be a total disaster. Like, no one's doing that because everybody's going to be happy that didn't occur. Those with underlying conditions need to be accommodated. No question. And it's my hope that the first thing school districts address for those in face-to-face models especially was PPE, cleaning supplies, aggressive cleaning schedules, and physical distancing. Now, that said, we can't instantly double the size of schools, so this is definitely going to be tough and challenging in many schools. Now, on the heels of that, I hope we're thinking about models that balance safety and learning. I mean, the changes in timetable schedules, the creation of learning cohorts, the mandatory wearing of masks, etc., are all incredibly wise approaches to this, and I've seen a lot of that. This is stressful, and teachers are doing heroic work. I mean, some of the work is impossible. The idea that teachers have face-to-face learners and remote learners simultaneously is ridiculous, but I'm going to save that rant for another time. Find your balance. Take what you hear and what you experience to form your truth about this situation. The what-if scenarios are endless, and if a local outbreak happens, then school districts, even individual schools, need to be able to react swiftly and reasonably. Balancing our lived and described experiences is, for me, the key to navigating this 2020-2021 school year. Being diligent and fear-mongering are not the same thing. Being cautious and being paranoid are not either. Find your balance, keep your mindset as local as possible, and be mindful that neither overreacting or underreacting is going to be helpful in the long run. Okay, joining me this week for the interview is Tom Guskey. This is a man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. Tom is a senior research scholar at the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Louisville, and professor emeritus in the College of Education at the University of Kentucky. Tom is the author and editor of 25 books, and believe it or not, 250 book chapters, articles, professional papers on educational measurement, on evaluation, assessment, grading, and professional learning. And if that wasn't enough, he served on the policy research team of the National Commission on Teaching and America's Future and on the task force to develop national standards for professional development. This man has had a ridiculously influential career. On a personal note, I'm just very grateful to call Tom Guskey a friend. As I thought about who I would want in the interview for episode 1 of the Tom Schimmer podcast, I could think of no better person to have than Tom Guskey. So Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Tom. It's really my pleasure and honor to be here with you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation today because obviously there's a lot to get to, and I want to spend some time obviously today talking about assessment and grading during the pandemic and hybrid learning and all of that. But I want to table that for a moment because I want to talk a little bit about your career and where it all began. You began as a middle school teacher. You were a school administrator in the Chicago public schools. So I want to take you back and take us back to when you began your career. Why education? Who or what inspired you to become an educator?
Well, unlike most of our colleagues, I sort of stumbled into education. I graduated from college with a degree in electrical engineering and physics. But by that time, I decided that not only did I not like that very much, I wasn't very good at it. I was working as I was actually working for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Resources, and I knew that sounds fancy, but I was really a glorified lifeguard. I was training lifeguards for the state park system in Pennsylvania, and then I was a ski instructor in the winter. I thought that might be a career that could probably last me until about 30 or 35. And I was at a party one night talking to a friend of mine who was looking for a teaching job. And he told me about this private independent school that needed a math teacher who could also coach. And this was the third week of August. So I went and applied for the job and they hired me. Uh, I hadn't really had a background in education at all, but I began teaching grades 7 and 8, and I just fell in love with it. It was amazing. I worked so hard. I began taking courses in education. It was compulsory part of my hiring that I do gain my certification. So I began taking the course that I needed to do that, and then actually did student teaching in my own classroom to gain my certification. But I know a lot of people struggle with middle school kids. They are totally confused, but they're a great age to work with. And it was just a turnaround in my life. I found something that I truly loved, and it was magic. So from that, I just decided this is what I wanted to do and wanted to become as good at it as I could.
Yeah, I think it's similar stories to a lot of folks who get into teaching and then fall in love with the profession. Obviously, some people choose the profession because they love it from the get-go, but many choose the profession and then they start to realize how rewarding and how wonderful it can be. So let's flash forward now to how do you end up as a graduate student with Benjamin Bloom? You were there with the Benjamin Bloom. So, how does that happen, and what was it like being a graduate student with Benjamin Bloom?
Well, after several years of teaching, I decided that I wanted to go back to graduate school to learn how to become a better teacher. So I saved up enough money to sort of support myself for that, and I left teaching. I began in Boston and was going to finish my master's program in education psychology. And while there, some of the faculty that I met at Boston College convinced me that I should really be interested in pursuing a higher degree in education and should look into the program at the University of Chicago. So I applied and was accepted. Of course, I wasn't convinced that Chicago was the place I wanted to be, so I also applied at Harvard and at Stanford University. Got accepted at those. Being in Boston, I was fairly familiar with the Harvard program and wasn't sure it was the direction I wanted to pursue. But I did fly to Stanford and visited their campus, and then went from Palo Alto and San Francisco back to Chicago to visit there. I had an interview with Benjamin Bloom while I was on the University of Chicago campus. He knew that I had just come from Stanford. And at one point, he said to me, he said, Mr. Guskey, what you really need to consider are the people who are doing really important work in the field. He said, they're at Stanford University. It's a wonderful campus, a great program. They have 80 some people in their school of education. But of those, you maybe have 15, 16 that are doing really important work. He said, here at Chicago, we only have 35, and we have 35 of those kinds of people. And so I turned to him and I said, well, Professor Bloom, would you really consider this to be the best school in the country in this area? And he shook his head and turned to me and said, the world. and,
Wow.
and he convinced me. Yeah, I mean, he was so passionate about what they had to offer there. But to be honest with you, Tom, there were many a cold Chicago morning when I said, "You dummy, you could be in Palo Alto right now."
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you could be in Northern California enjoying the California sunshine versus
Right.
University of Chicago. The University of Chicago has quite the illustrious list of besides. We'll get back to Benjamin Bloom in a moment, but can you, for listeners, can you help them sort of understand the legacy of the University of Chicago in terms of the Department of Education?
Sure. The University of Chicago is primarily a graduate school.
Yeah.
There are about 10,000 students, but only about 2,000 in the college, about 8,000 graduate students. They're
Yeah.
known for many of their colleges. They have the reputation of having the largest number of Nobel laureates on their faculty of any school.
Hmm.
And when I was there in education, there were the three top schools that always varied back and forth as to how the rating was going to be held. And that was the University of Chicago, the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and Stanford University.
Hmm.
The comparison was always made was that the question about the glass being half full or half empty, that the Harvard people always thought the glass was half empty because they were kind of pessimistic about it. And
Hmm.
the Stanford people always thought the glass was half full because it was California and they were always optimistic. The
Yeah.
University of Chicago people said, have you ever thought about the size of the glass? So it was
That's a
just
great analogy.
a whole different kind of orientation. But no,
Yeah.
it was the education building there was Judd Hall. Judd was the person who really changed the whole dynamic of the study of education. He was convinced that education was a discipline in and of itself, and so pressed for it to be a unique discipline.
Mhm.
It was the home of Ralph Tyler. John Dewey began his career there and then began the laboratory school at the University of Chicago. And even when I went, it was a candy store of picking these amazing people. Many of the people that I had been studying when I was in school in Boston were there on the faculty. So it was quite remarkable.
Yeah, wow. It is quite the lineup and quite the legacy, that's for sure. I mean, for many of you out there listening, you may not know, uh, Tom actually edited a book about Benjamin Bloom and called Portraits of an Educator, where it's now, I believe, in its second edition. Tom, is that correct? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, we're thinking about doing a third now.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So it really is a compilation of stories from people just in Benjamin Bloom's both personal life and professional life around just the legacy of the man and the educator. And it's a wonderful read for any of you that are interested in sort of reading more about Benjamin Bloom. One of the things that might strike people, one of the things you mentioned in the book is how quick-witted and humorous Benjamin Bloom was, which may surprise people because I think a lot of people now just think of the taxonomy or mastery learning, but don't, always almost don't think of the fact that here's a man who had, was humorous, quick-witted, funny. Anything to share about some of that and give us some context about his nature and kind of the way that he conducted himself and how you came to understand that side of him?
Sure. I guess that when I began studying there and learning more about him and the people with whom he worked, I began to discover this amazing collection of stories about him. And I knew some of them, but I didn't know them all. And so after he passed away in 1999, I decided it would be a good idea to maybe put those together. With connections at the university, I was able to get a list of all the doctoral committees in which he had served during his time at the University of Chicago. He began serving on doctoral committees actually in 1948 and did so through 1991. I mean, I was one of his very last sort of doctoral students. He served as the director of 66 doctoral dissertations and served in the committees of 69 other doctoral students there, which as a scholar is an amazing sort of collection of students to have worked with. But I was able to get all their names and I wrote to them and I said, if you have an interesting story about him that you'd like to share, I'd like you to send it to me. And within just days, I was getting letters from all around the world. And I also wrote to all his former faculty colleagues and asked them the same. And they revealed a very different side of this brilliant scholar that everybody knows through the work.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who was quick-witted, someone who had his own sort of idiosyncrasies, and it was just tremendous. And to see the powerful impact he had on the life of some of these quite remarkable people, how he stood up for those who were innocent and not able to protect themselves, how he was a champion of the underprivileged, and his the way he was able to turn problems around in his mind and see them in ways that other people before him had never seen, and just his total optimistic perspective. One of the stories that I contributed shortly after graduating, I took a position with the University of Kentucky as both a professor of education psychology and then as director of a educational research center at the university. But after being there just 2 years, the Chicago had a sort of an alliance of people from the University of Chicago, Chicago Public Schools, and Northwestern University. They established this, what they call the Center for the Improvement of Teaching and Learning. They were able to get a lot of grant money to fund it. And because I had been at the university, worked with Chicago Public Schools, they thought I would be a perfect person to head it. And of course, I was very new in my academic career and thought that that would not be a good thing to do. So I posed these outrageous conditions, which they met. So I I left and moved back to Chicago and to begin heading this research center. I had asked Benjamin Bloom to serve as a member of our board of directors, and he graciously agreed. We outlined a series of studies that were tremendously ambitious of what we were going to do. We were going to focus uh, on post-secondary education first, but we wanted to find ways to improve student learning that could be very cost effective. And we focused on the community college environment because they had open enrollment. There were no restrictions on enrollment, so they had to take anybody who walked through the door. Uh, so we did this. And it was a terribly difficult year. The studies became much more complicated than we thought. We ran into political issues. Uh, I was working 6, 7 days every week and 10, 12, 14 hours every day. But at the end, we had a conference where we invited all the major community college systems from around the country to come and share in this research and then take studies that they could do at their own campuses. We were going to coordinate a national effort in this. And they all agreed. It was really amazing.
Wow.
So on the opening morning of the conference, um, Benjamin Bloom came downtown, met me at my office, and we walked together from the office over to the hotel where the conference was being sponsored. We were talking about the work and what we had accomplished over the year. And at one point, he said to me, "You know, Tom, I never thought this would be possible." I was stunned. I was absolutely stunned. And I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and I turned to him and I said, "What do you mean you don't think this was possible? You told me from the start, this is what you expected. This is what we were going to set out to do. Do you know how hard I worked? Do you know what this meant to be going through this entire year?" And he could see my anger. And he just reached over and he put his arm on my shoulder. He said, "Tom, I've never let my expectations be limited to that which I thought was possible.
Mm.
And you need to do the same."
Wow.
I know. Right there, I just thought in that sentence, he captured the entire essence of what guided him throughout his career. That our expectations shouldn't be limited to what we think is possible, that we only make
Hmm.
dramatic improvements when we see beyond our expectations and view what others might see as impossible, but we see a pathway to get there.
Yeah.
And
That
it was just remarkable.
That is incredible advice, regardless of the field you're working in. I mean, just in terms of how we live every day. Okay, one more question with regards to Bloom, but I want to talk a little bit about the taxonomy, and I want to take a bit of an angle because, Bloom's taxonomy is fairly ubiquitous, whether we're talking about the original taxonomy or even the revised version. Most people are familiar with it. But I'm wondering if there are still to this day aspects of the taxonomy that teachers and principals and district leaders, are there aspects of the taxonomy that people still misunderstand or still misapply or anything like that?
Yes, I think there are actually many. Benjamin Bloom always referred to the taxonomy as the most widely cited, least read book in all of education. And by that, he meant that people sort of knew a bit about what it was about, but nobody ever read it. And even if you look at many of the criticisms that have been sort of posed against the taxonomy, if you go back and read the introduction, these were some really brilliant people who were brought together to develop this. And as part of their brilliance, they anticipated the criticisms and they addressed those right from the start.
Mhm.
And so to go back and read this book that was actually published first in 1956, but it has a longer history than that. They what the way the taxonomy was developed was that in the late 1940s, as the soldiers were returning, men and women both from World War II, we passed the GI Bill here in the United States, and as part of that, they began going to college and universities. College and universities were growing dramatically at that time, and there was a concern about the introductory level courses at college universities because there would be maybe 10, 12, 15 sections taught of a single course, and how could they guarantee comparable rigor in those courses? Many universities established what they called the Office of the University Examiner. And this university examiner would be in charge of directing the faculty to develop one course exam. So if you went to a place like Ohio State or Wisconsin, they might have 20 different sections of English 101. But these university examiners would pull together the faculty and say, let's develop one exam that we will give to all students in all sections. So there will be some common metric by which we can see or determine student achievement in these classes. Bloom was the university examiner at the University of Chicago. And he found that one of the things that was difficult was that these examinations they were developing with faculty members differed so drastically in their format and their rigor. And so you would go to a subject like biology, and the exam would be composed of 600 questions. And then they'd go to the philosophy department, and they would have two. So they found that they needed to have some way of putting this together. So Bloom in 1948 just wrote to all these university examiners and said, let's get together and talk about our problems. They began meeting at the American Psychological Association. And through their work, they developed this taxonomy of looking at the cognitive complexity of different learning goals. They published the first version of it in 1954, I guess. But nobody thought it was very important. They couldn't find a publisher for it. It wasn't until 1956 they found this little tiny publisher in New York City called McKay that decided to publish it, and they printed 5,000 copies. Between 1956 and 1966, it did not sell those 5,000 copies. Between 1966 and 1976, it sold over 1 million copies.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's one of the very few million sellers we have in education because it became the foundation for curriculum development throughout the world.
Wow.
And so I can remember when my first book was published and it wasn't doing so well, and I was kind of frustrated. I talked to Bloom, and he said to me, Tom, remember the taxonomy. You know, if it's ahead of its time, it won't sell right now, but maybe some years from now it will.
Right. That's good. What are, so if we were to pinpoint the biggest misunderstanding people today have about the taxonomy, what would you say that would be?
Well, I think that there are two. The first is this this pyramid structure where people want to look at the levels of taxonomy as a pyramid, with knowledge at the bottom, going up comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, evaluation. Bloom never saw it in that way or believed that that was a misrepresentation of what it should be about. And he stressed, and they wrote about this in the introduction to the original version, that this is looking at differences in cognitive complexity. It was not the same as difficulty. That you can ask some very low questions that are extremely difficult for students. And they also stressed that it was related to instruction. And so if the teacher teaches a particular application really well, and then asks the students about it on an assessment, it might look like that's an application question, but to those students, it's just recall. They have to remember what the teacher said in class. So this complexity and difficulty mixing, they thought was major dilemma for it. That just because it's higher level doesn't mean it's more difficult. That depends on the instruction and that. And the second was that the necessity of one being a necessary prerequisite for the other. So that he realized that in order to deal with higher level skills, you had to have a content base. Howard Gardner made this same point too, and he's been very passionate too about making sure that people understand how reasonable the taxonomy was. But he said, in order to think outside the box, you must first have a box. And that means that you can't teach thinking skills without content. You have to think about something. And so you have to have this content base in order to extend it to these higher levels. But that content base doesn't always have to be complete. So, for example, if I pose to people a really complex problem dealing with subtraction, I think that a lot of people today could probably get it right. But if I ask you, in a subtraction problem, can you tell me which term is the subtrahend and which is the minuend? That might be a little bit more difficult. It might be more difficult in the problem-solving task. But it's just that knowing the definitions of those terms was not a necessary prerequisite for being able to solve a complex problem in subtraction. So I would say those two things.
Almost making it too much of a hierarchy and prerequisite focus, right? So
yes, you realize that it's differences in complexity, but complexity is also altered depending upon instruction.
Right. Okay, let's shift gears now and let's talk a little bit about our current situation. Obviously, first I want to take a look back. You and I were talking earlier about before we started the interview, we were talking a little bit about how things just dramatically shifted in March, obviously, with the pandemic. And so schools had to pivot to remote learning. So when you look back to, say, March up until the end of last school year, what lessons do you think we learned through the acute situation of having to almost reimagine what education was going to look like on the fly? It was almost at a moment's notice. What sorts of lessons do you think we learned from March until the end of the school year?
Well, I think that in this way, we really compelled teachers to make drastic changes overnight. Even here in Kentucky, there was a major effort to have teachers be prepared for sort of a remote learning environment. It was done because of problems in winter and snow days. That we had school districts, many of our rural school districts, the school buses were unable to run, and so they would lose significant numbers of days due to bad weather. And in order to accommodate that, there was a major effort by the State Department of Education to have teachers be prepared for at least 2 weeks of remote instruction, so that if we had to call off school because of transportation difficulties and dangers to students in getting to school, that we would still be able to have remote learning taking place. But there was not the the vision of having to extend that to 3 or 4 months, which we ended up doing.
Yeah.
And when we did this, I think the major changes that it compelled teachers to make were in our areas, the area of assessment and the area of grading. Um, and in particular, it caused teachers to think about this whole purpose of assessment and to find a way of dealing with these sort of different constraints and different pulls that were placed upon them. The first is the need for having assessments that deal with the issues of accountability and grading. And the second is the area of feedback and learning. And we found that those didn't always coincide and they pulled teachers in different directions. And as we came into the pandemic, we moved to remote learning, we saw the restrictions that teachers were placed upon. It really compelled teachers to choose between those. And I think fortunately for us, the vast majority of teachers chose the feedback learning direction and said, we're most concerned about helping our kids learn really well. And we're going to make some sacrifices and 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 put aside issues of accountability and put aside issues of grading for the sake of the learning of kids. And so assessments took us in that direction. Then when we looked at the grading issues, we realized that teachers were going to be limited in the kind of information they were going to get from kids. And not only because of inequities in access, but the restrictions of format. So one of the first things that was done was to limit the number of grading distinctions that teachers had to make. So college universities, for example, abandoned the letter grade system and went to a complete or incomplete or a success and or incomplete status. Schools, many schools went for the same, or at least they got rid of percentages and moved to sort of a letter grade system or a three-level system. And that was a really good thing to do because it compelled teachers to really be clear about the criteria for success and then to set those and make sure those were communicated clearly to everyone and then adhere to those to in their planning and their instruction later on. So I think the silver lining was that it pushed us in a direction that teachers really wanted to move and were then compelled to move because the constraints of the situation in which we were working.
So we had to make, obviously, in the school systems, we had to make some very acute decisions. It was almost like triage. What do we prioritize? How do we make this work? As you look forward now, when you see the myriad of reopening plans in North America, when you think about the potential for, the different iterations that could unfold during this school year, we could be in a face-to-face on-site learning and then have to go hybrid and then maybe in full lockdown. And no one really knows what this school year is going to bring. What are, looking forward now, what are, in your mind, some of the assessment and grading fundamentals that teachers need to either continue to keep in mind or develop in terms of their priorities going forward?
Well, I think it gets back to those two major issues having to do with assessments and grading. With assessments, the focus on feedback and learning. I think teachers have seen that if we're going to deal with inequities in terms of access to high-speed internet, inequities in terms of the resources and materials available to students in their homes, inequities in terms of adult support. That
Hmm.
we have many children in homes where their parents are really supportive of education, but they have jobs or professions that take them outside the home. They're healthcare workers or social service providers in ways that they cannot be there to support their kids. And even for teachers to understand that they are trying to provide for their own children in many cases while providing for their classes. I think that the pandemic has helped everybody understand the important work that teachers do and how valuable and how critically important that is and how difficult that is. As parents took over from teachers, they started to see this is really hard. And
Yeah.
I'm doing it with my own kids who I really love. When I have to deal with 20, 25, 30 kids that I just can't imagine how a teacher could do that. So it's added, I think, additional respect and consideration for the fantastic job that teachers do. But for their part, it's help teachers understand that if we're going to make these decisions, let's come down on the side of kids. And let's look at all these restrictions that are placed upon us with regard to accountability, performance on a single overall assessment. What can we do to really focus on the learning and and the feedback aspects of assessments to help them become learning tools to really facilitate learning. And then we'll gather information from kids in ways that are reasonable to determine that reporting aspect and the grading aspect we have to. And
Yeah.
then in terms of the grading, to do that more thoughtfully, that maybe distinguishing 101 levels of performance is not a reasonable thing to do. That it's hard enough for teachers to do five. When universities decided the university faculties couldn't do five, they could only do two. I think that sent a really powerful message that maybe we need to be thinking about how much consistency we can have in grading. And can two teachers look at the same body of evidence and come up with the same decision about a grade? And if there are 101 categories, that's almost impossible. If you get it down to three or four or five, then it's more reasonable and it communicates well the kind of things we want to do for kids and for their parents and families.
Yeah. So you, from your perspective, we can grade and report virtual learning as long as in the setup we are uh, able to make those finer distinctions around those 3 to 5 levels versus the 101, and we have clear criteria set up that allows teachers to be consistent with how they examine student evidence.
Yes, that's very true, Tom. And then I think the other part of it is to recognize the hardships that are created when we try to combine everything into a single grade.
Mhm.
A lot of the consideration of teachers when we've gone to these remote learning or learning from home environments, virtual kind of environments, have been concerned with engagement and what do we do to keep kids engaged and their participation in these things overall, and to really to step back from that and say that's really important. I know that equity issues are really paramount when it comes to those kind of factors, but we need to consider those separate from what the kids learned. And so if we think it's important to report both, let's do it, but let's do it separately. So this notion of getting away from a single grade for everything, where all these diverse sources of information are combined, to provide a more profile of performance with multiple grades on different aspects of learning related to these different types of learning criteria.
Right. You almost get a more complete picture of the learner, given all those separate reporting categories versus having it all amalgamated into one singular level, grade, or score. I want to finish today with one more question, and then we're going to finish with a bit of a fun activity. What's the one thing in your career? What's the one thing you now know that you wish you would have known at the start of your career?
Uh, I guess the thing I wish I would have known, and maybe it came from my background in uh, sort of engineering, was that how how important it is to learn from your mistakes. I I mean, both of us, because of the work we do, and we make presentations and we are trying to communicate important ideas to people that we care about and hope to do well. Sometimes we do that well, and sometimes we don't.
Yeah.
Uh, But there's something to be learned in not doing it well. And so you go back and say, well, I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to find a better way of doing it. Every time we make a presentation or we have an opportunity to interact with a group of folks, we step back and there's a reflective part that says, this came across well. I think I helped people in this way, but this took away from the message and this didn't go so well. And I think at the beginning, I was more interested in trying to be perfect with everything. And now I realize that sometimes you screw up and that's okay. Uh, but that's a way to really learn. It's not bad to screw up. To screw up in the same way over and over again is bad. So just
Yeah.
recognize it when you do it, reflect on it, and find ways to make it better.
Yeah, I think that's it's interesting that you say that because I find myself also with that same idea that as I get older, I'm just more comfortable with the mistakes and learning from them and not thinking they're such a big deal as I would have been, in my younger days. Okay, so let's finish with a bit of a fun exercise here, just so people can get to know you a little bit more on a personal level. We're gonna do a little game I'm going to call This or That. So I'm going to present to you some choices, and you have to pick one or the other, or you can go off script and pick a third option if neither fits your personality or what you're all about. So these are just fun, lighthearted. We're going to begin with a few choices, and then you can expand on your choice at all. So the first choice I want to give you is Facebook or Twitter. Which one for you?
Oh wow. I guess both. I use them differently. I mean, Twitter is professional stuff. I share with professional stuff on Twitter. Facebook is more personal, where I get things from friends and my photographs for my kids and things like that. Overall, so yeah, I just use them. I use both, but use them for different
Use
purposes.
them for different purposes. Yeah, I think a lot of people sort of look at that way. Okay, sweet or savory?
Ooh, that's really hard. I would. I know this is going to sound odd, but yeah, I like kind of. I have to say, I put them together. I mean, I like chocolate chip cookies. So you got nuts and you got chocolate in them both. So they're my favorite dessert. I would, yeah, I'd have to say I have to have them together.
Tom, that's two questions, and you've walked the fence on both of them. So I'm going
I
to start to
know.
press you a little bit. You got to make a choice here.
Okay.
Okay, here we go. Are you a morning person or an evening person? Mornings or evenings? Don't you
I
can't say
tend to be,
both.
yeah, I tend to be a morning person.
Yeah.
Uh, I like to get up early. I get in the shower right away, get cleaned up. I always have a great breakfast. In the morning is my time when I do most of my writing, and that's so it's the time when it gets later in the day. Then I can exercise or I can read others' work, but I can't. I'm not as productive. I'm a morning
Right.
person.
Okay, awesome. Okay, fourth question: spring or fall? Which season?
Oh, fall is probably my favorite season. And I've always grown up in places where we had a lot of winter or fall foliage. So it's a time of color, the briskness of the air, the chill. My father was a really passionate outdoorsman. And so fall was always the time when we would be out in the fields and going about like that. So I like fall a lot. I'm getting ready for it here. It's looking forward to it a lot.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Okay, last one. Are you comedies or action movies?
I am a sucker for romantic comedies.
Romantic comedies. Okay.
Yeah, I I have passed that stage in my life where I want movies to prompt me to new and deeper ways of thinking. I want to feel better when I leave the theater than when I walked in. And so, yeah, in fact, I would say the movies that I have seen multiple times, and they can be, I mean, I wouldn't consider Casablanca a romantic comedy, but it is terribly romantic. Uh, so yeah, I tend to be a romantic at heart, and so romantic movies and romantic comedies would definitely be my favorite.
Do you have a favorite all-time rom-com?
Oh wow, there are lots. In fact, I've been, um, I I've been watching recently. Recently, they've had um, they've been broadcasting with the Black Lives Matter uh, movement, and that a lot of these movies that have been really terrific in this way. And so, one of my favorite movies is a movie called Remember the Titans
Hmm.
that talked about the racial integration of the school system in Alexandria and the football team there. Um, 42, the Jackie Robinson story.
Hmm.
Express, the, about the first African American Heisman Trophy winner. Uh, and those movies, I think they're so inspirational, and they recognize injustice. Um, People that have worked so hard and suffered so greatly to to confront those situations, bringing them out. Those kind of things inspire me, and so those would be among my favorites. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, all great movies for sure. Okay, I've got one final question for you, and this is a question I'm going to ask everyone that comes on the podcast, and that is this. And it has more to do with success in general than necessarily success for educators, but success for people. So if a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, "What is your definition of success?" How would you answer them?
Mhm. Actually, this is an easier question for me than any other, uh, and it's only because um, when I was in school in Boston, I developed a fascination with the work of Ralph Emerson and Henry Thoreau. I lived in a little town called Acton, which is the next town out from Concord, and so I drove by the Emerson's home and Walden Pond all the time, and read everything I could find about their works. And that there's a wonderful quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson that actually I have memorized and I recite before I make any presentation. And it is this. He said, to laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children, to earn the appreciation of honest critics and endure the betrayal of false friends, to appreciate beauty, to look for the best in others, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition, to know that one life has breathed easier because you have lived. That is to have succeeded.
Wow.
I recite that to myself every before I make every presentation, and it sort of inspires me to what I want to do in a presentation. And so it's not mine, but it's always been really important to me. And so that's how I would define success.
Awesome. Well, Tom, I think that is a great place for us to finish up today. I really do appreciate your time. Certainly appreciate all of your insight. The stories was just fascinating to hear you talk about the early days and all of that. For those of you listening right now, you can find Tom on Twitter. It's at T Guskey. His website with all of the information about how to access publications, how to book Tom for presentations. That's tguskey.com. And so, Tom, thanks again for your time today, and I hope we can do this again soon.
Tom, I look forward to it. Thank you so much. It's been my
All right.
honor.
All right. Have a great day. Thanks, Tom. In the news this week begins with a story from the Salt Lake Tribune, a story written by Courtney Tanner, who is writing about the Utah Department of Health's program of voluntary COVID testing. But here's the key. It's a testing protocol for teachers and public school K-12 staff, whether or not they have symptoms or not. Because, of course, people are stressed out about being an asymptomatic carrier and taking COVID home. Now, again, the program, at least as reported, is meant to be voluntary and meant to kind of ease the stress and give teachers and public school staff some peace of mind. I think that's a really interesting idea to think about the testing. I want to read you a bit of the article here. Quote, every school district will be provided with a unique code. A teacher or staffer there who wants to get tested will be given that code and will enter it on Test Utah's website to get an order for a test. It doesn't matter if they have symptoms, which has been preferred in the state to qualify for a test. The faculty member will be able to go to any Test Utah location and get swabbed. The code will tie the teachers to their school so the state can track outbreaks. And the hope is to get a sense of how much coronavirus is spreading in the schools. So I can see some people thinking about sort of the big brother element of this, where tracking testing, but I'm not sure how else we track COVID spreading without doing this contact tracing. And again, the program is voluntary, so it's not as though you're being forced to, but I think this is an interesting approach, because I think in some respects, testing may be the key to us getting back to some semblance of normalcy. Can we find a way to get more efficient and more effective testing and a more effective and efficient turnaround on those testing? You know, I'm sort of imagining the idea that, and if I can imagine it, I'm sure a lot of people can, the idea that I could test myself and then maybe upload that data to an app or print something out that says within the last 24 hours I have tested negative for COVID. I think that could be a key to some return to normalcy. I think about, you know, how do we attend large events like professional sports or college sports? How do we get a large number of people in a small space or a very confined space? And it makes me think about, would I line up, you know, a half hour before a sporting event, maybe earlier than I would normally go, to be tested to see if, you know, I should be let into the game or allowed to see the concert or whatever it might be. Or maybe I could bring that positive test with me and have some confirmation that in the last 24 hours, I have actually tested negative. So just an interesting idea around testing. And I think for schools where some of the physical distancing may be challenging, this could be a key for how, in the long run, we continue to make sure that those who are in the building are negative and not spreading the virus, and allowing sort of school to continue in some semblance of normalcy, even though there's nothing abnormal about this fall. So I'm going to keep an eye on that, because it seems to me, again, that testing could be the key to that. I remember the long waits for testing turnaround back in February and March and April. So hopefully we can find some ways to and when I say we, I'm using the royal we, of course, but hopefully there's a way that scientists can sort of perfect testing to a point where we get a much quicker turnaround. It'll be interesting to watch, and if I hear anything more about that, I'll bring that to the podcast, of course. Our next story comes from the province of Alberta, and this was a story that came out about a month or so ago, and the Minister of Education in Alberta announced that they were going to develop a new guiding vision for K-12 education. And as I read through the news story about this announcement, there were some things about this announcement that would cause me to be concerned. Now, I'm going to reserve judgment completely, because it'll be interesting to see how things unfold. But the first thing that caught my attention was the minister talking about the guiding vision being a return to proven teaching methods. And, you know, I've never seen curriculum documents or standards or outcomes ever dictate instructional methods. And so right away, it tells me that the Minister of Education doesn't really understand the difference between, pedagogy and curriculum and or outcomes. Now, there are some positives. I don't want to make it all negative. There are some positives. In the announcement, they talked about character development, and they talked about community engagement, and those are positives, and that financial literacy would be woven through the curriculum, and that's also a positive. But what caught my attention was one of the outcomes for learning was headlined as knowledge development, and that, quote, students will demonstrate mastery in foundational subject-specific content, end quote. That, to me, on the surface, sounds incredibly regressive. There's nothing really in anything that I've read so far that talks about 21st century preparedness, critical thinking, collaborative thinking, innovation, creativity. On the surface, it feels as if this is kind of one of those romanticized return to the glory days of where the predominant sort of instructional experience and educational experience was about memorizing facts and being able to recall long lists of procedures, etc. Now, I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that when we see the details of how the new vision for education in Alberta unfolds, I hope that we see more of that, and we see more of the forward-leaning kind of relevant and important outcomes that students need for the 21st century. But definitely based on the material I saw, I would personally have some concerns about the direction that this new vision is going. It feels like a recycled old vision as opposed to a new vision. But again, the details will tell us whether or not this is going to be a regressive policy or whether or not this is going to be a progressive policy. But right now, based on that story and the ministerial order that came out directly from the government, while there are some positive things, it certainly causes me a little hesitation about the direction that they're going. Time now for Assessment Corner, and we have two questions this week. The first comes from Diane in Alberta, who asks, how might teachers approach data analysis in a way that is relevant, affirming, and impacts instruction? I'm especially thinking about how we can use those large-scale provincial or divisional assessments to actually improve student learning. Well, this is a tough one and probably requires a much more extensive answer than I'll probably be able to give here on the podcast. So I might revisit this question in a future podcast. But it's a tough one because there isn't only one purpose for assessment. Assessment serves a number of different purposes, not just the formative and summative divide, but the idea that large-scale assessment is focused on large-scale sort of decision-making and large-scale assessment of the learners in a particular jurisdiction, whether that be a state, a province, or a school district. There, for me, would be a number of questions I would ask about the assessments that Diane would be asking about. First, it would be how granular is the data that you're receiving as a result of the assessment. The more granular the data is, the more you can really directly pinpoint instructional decisions that would help improve student learning. The other is, what's the timing of the data? If you're receiving the data sort of at the end of the year or the beginning of the following school year, you as the teacher may not be able to do anything about improving student learning. But so then what's the communication system for how this goes into next year and how the teachers in the following school year are going to use it to improve student learning? Another question would be, does the large-scale assessment provide an adequate sampling that would allow you to make a fairly specific judgment about where learners are? Is that the purpose of the assessment? Or is this really a snapshot that's just a moment in time that this sort of larger governing body, whether it's the state, the province, or even the district, it's just a snapshot in time to take inventory on where learners are? And of course, with large-scale assessment, we would always want to ask the question about, is the assessment itself culturally responsive? Is it free of bias? There's a number of different questions we could ask as well in terms of how inclusive the assessment itself is. So there's a lot of questions about large-scale assessment for sure. So those would be questions that I would want to know to be able to give a more specific answer about Diane's question. But let's just take it on the surface and say, okay, how do we use large-scale assessment to improve student learning? So my perspective on that is that every assessment level has a place, but every assessment level should be left in its place. I think where we often make the biggest errors, if you will, is trying to take large-scale once-a-year assessments and have those drive day-to-day decision-making in the classroom. Now, again, this is a question about can you versus should you. Can you use large-scale assessment to improve student learning? Well, of course you can. But the question is whether or not you should, and the question would be, should that be your primary way that you focus your attention on student learning? So, for me, large-scale assessment is about large-scale decision-making. What we should not be doing with large-scale assessment is beating up teachers with the data. We should not be ranking schools and all of those other sort of peripheral things that really distract us from using this data in a most appropriate way. Now, when a district has district-wide assessments, then I see that as a district-wide decision-making level. So we make decisions at the district level, and then it's classroom assessment on a day-to-day basis that allows us to make day-to-day decisions. And it is those day-to-day decisions where improving learning is really going to happen. So back to the question, okay, so is the data coming to you in a way that is usable? And if it's broad-based, then as a school, we would ask in district-wide, as a school, have we, or even at provincial or state level, as a district, have we been able to support the growth of our learners or support the improvement of student learning? Now, Again, the individual student data is going to be dependent upon the format you get, the format of the assessment, the specificity of the data. Did you get the adequate sampling? All of those questions I brought up earlier. Remember that assessment is primarily driven by purpose. So purpose is a really important assessment tenet because purpose tells you what you intend to do with the data. Now, we usually divide our purpose between formative and summative, but I suppose there are layers within each of those. So what's my primary purpose of assessing? Like, why do I want this information and what do I intend to do with it? So large-scale assessment really is about verification. I mean, it really does serve primarily a summative purpose to verify what learning has occurred, the degree to which it has occurred, and then being able to sort of make decisions on a more broad-based scale. So we would use the data alongside classroom data to help us figure out pacing or figure out, pedagogy or the distribution of our instructional minutes. Are we emphasizing the right things? Are our learners actually getting to the places we need them to get? What are our instructional priorities, etc.? I'm not sure that on its own, a large-scale assessment is going to help you improve individual student learning, but you can improve student learning in general by looking more generically, or say a view of 20,000 feet and saying, okay, what could we do in terms of our programming, in terms of our distribution of time, our priorities, and all the things I just talked about. So can you improve student learning? Sure. But I'm not sure on their own a one-time per year large-scale assessment, or maybe it's a 2 times a year district-level assessment, is going to give you enough information to really have an impact on the individual student in terms of what's next for that learner. But if you put that information alongside what you know from your classroom assessments, I think you then get the complete picture. So as a department or as a school, as a district, this is where we can start to prioritize our programming and begin to think about our larger approach within the school so that there's consistency across our schools, so that a student's education is not dependent upon what school they go to or not dependent upon what teacher they have, but there's consistency with which we approach the students and how we approach their improvement. Our next question comes from Chris, and Chris is in Jakarta, Indonesia. And Chris writes, recent research from the American Psychological Association indicates that feedback without grades leads to improved achievement and motivation in learners. It seems that even the existence of letter grades leads to worse outcomes. Alfie Kohn summarized in a tweet, and he's quoting Alfie Kohn here, new meta-analyses, reviews of multiple studies, confirm that substantive feedback without grades is preferable for student motivation and achievement. Grades were worse than nothing at all regarding motivation to learn, with the most damage to struggling and or older students. That's end quote. Chris goes on to ask, what are your thoughts on this research and the implications of this research for how or if teachers and schools should use letter grades in their practice? Well, again, some of this comes down to thinking about the purpose of grades. And again, depending upon how you define grades. But if we're talking about grades as in terms of a report card or an end of school year, in most cases, grades are about verification, of course. They're about verifying what learning has occurred and the degree to which the learning has occurred. And we sometimes get a little caught up in this conversation about, and I see this when I do workshops and conferences and speak at different schools where they say, well, Tom, can you tell me how, say, moving to standards-based grading is going to improve student achievement? And again, that's where we're starting to mix up our purposes, because grading isn't about increasing achievement or improving achievement. Grading is not a strategy. Grading is not an intervention. Grading is verification. It's measurement. It's verifying what learning has occurred. As we previously talked about in Diane's question, it was the idea of improving student achievement is through primarily the formative purpose and how we use information to keep learning on track day-to-day on a day-to-day basis. So first of all, grades, no one's going to argue for more grading. Okay, let's just get that out of the way. I don't know anyone out there is saying the pathway to improvement is through increased grading. I just don't know anybody who's advocating that. However, I do think that, this has been a very common question that comes up, especially over the last 10 years. And I don't think it's coincidental that this topic has become less and less nuanced and less and less contextualized because of how we interact on social media. I'm going to have a lot more to say about that in a future podcast because I think there's some things about social media that are really, really wonderful, but there are also things about it that are inhibiting, meaningful and deeper dialogue about topics. And I think feedback is one of those. Social media has contributed to the loss of nuance and contextualization. And, with assessment, there are just very few definitives in assessment. Everything in assessment is nuanced and contextually sensitive. And yet we've reached this place where, when it comes to Chris's question, this idea that give a student a grade and the learning stops has almost become a mantra. And yet that causal relationship, at least to my knowledge, has never really been established. Now, certainly we have seen studies over the years that have shown correlation. And even in Alfie Cohen's quote that Chris has added in, the statement was feedback without grades is preferable. That doesn't sound causal. And so feedback, of course, is most favorable in absence of grades and scores. And we want feedback to primarily be a part of that formative purpose. And we don't want students to get distracted by a score, a level, a grade, because students can look at your feedback and deem it to be unnecessary if they are satisfied with the score that they've received or the level that they've been determined. Or they may deem your feedback to be undesirable because the level is just lower than they expected or, not what they were hoping for, right? So that could happen too. But it's not causal. It is not the case that give a student a grade and they immediately become, if grades stopped learning, then grades would have stopped learning. And we know that's not true. So a lot of this goes back to the Ruth Butler studies of the late 1980s. And it's interesting as I think back to my career, in the late 1980s, I was still in college. I was still in my teacher training. I started teaching in 1991. This is my 30th year in education. And as I was going through my teacher training and the beginnings of my career, no one talked about the Ruth Butler studies. In fact, we didn't hear much about the Ruth Butler studies for at least 15 years, if not 20 years. I think, it was in the late 2000s or even into 2010 and 2011 where, the Ruth Butler studies started to re-emerge, as being definitive about, giving feedback in absence of grades and scores. So it's almost as though the research came out in the late 1980s, we sat on it for 20 years, and then suddenly this is the most pertinent and relevant research. Now, I'm not trying to be dismissive of the research because I happen to agree with the idea of giving feedback in absence of grades and scores. What I push back on, though, is this definitiveness with which people make the assertions when there is so much to ask about feedback. Just giving feedback in absence of grades is not going to improve achievement, because we don't know if the feedback being provided is focused on the learner. Is the feedback just saying good job? Or is the feedback focused on the learning? Are you actually describing for the student what aspects were strong and what needs strengthening? Are you sort of tending to the emotional aspects of feedback and how students respond when they are given correctives and whether or not you are eliciting a productive response? Klugler and Denisi in 1996 really emphasized the importance of paying attention to how students react to feedback. And the deck is stacked against us because in the 8 ways that students could respond to feedback, they identified only 2 of them as being positive. That if the feedback shows that I haven't met my learning goal, the only productive response is to work harder at achieving that goal. And if the feedback indicates that I have met my goal, the only productive response is to set a new goal and continue to learn. So 6 of the 8 responses are essentially negative when it comes to feedback anyway. So there's no guarantee that just providing feedback is going to improve student learning if our feedback isn't really pointed at the right things. And it's not so much about structure, but are we actually giving feedback that is helpful and has utility so that the learner can keep learning? So again, no one's going to advocate for more grading, but the feedback, has to be focused on the learning. It has to identify those next steps. It has to balance both strengths and that which needs strengthening. It needs to be within reach for the learner, so it's not too sophisticated for where they are in their learning trajectory. And then they have to use the feedback in order to advance their learning. And if they do all of that, then I don't really have an issue personally with also telling the student, By the way, at this point, and fill in the blank of whatever demonstration it might be, you're at a 3, or you're proficient, or you're a B, or whatever your system sort of dictates. So in general, of course, I think it's fairly common that we know that feedback and absence of grades and scores is the most favorable course of action. But I just wanted to take the opportunity to encourage you to have a more nuanced conversation rather than just these sort of 140 or what are now 280 character tweets that really do get a lot of attention and a lot of likes and a lot of retweets, but aren't as nuanced and contextualized as they really need to be. Because what I'm finding personally is that the more I dig into the research on feedback, the more nuanced it is. And finally, I'll just say that, you just heard my interview with Tom Guskey. I would say that Tom recently wrote a blog post for Education Weekly, or I think it's on his blog site as well. If you go to tomguskey.com or tguskey.com, if you go to that website, you'll find he sort of took a deeper dive into this topic as well. So I just wanted to reference that. But again, assessment really does require more nuance, and we do really have to think about, not just making these wide sweeping assertions that really aren't exactly reflective of what the research says. Let's finish up with tweets of the week. And I'm actually going to focus on 2 really great follows for you. One from Instagram, and that is the account Teach for the Culture. I believe this is Shauna Brown, who's the founder. But just some incredibly thoughtful posts reminding us of the bigger picture around the work with racial equity and bringing about significant changes and trying to dismantle systemic racism. This most recent post caught my attention. The post says, "If you're serious about doing this work, remember that it's a marathon, not a sprint. There's a whole lot of 100-meter and 200-meter dashes going on right now, but the actual finish line is miles and miles away. Stay urgent but steady so that you can stay in the race." And just what I love about that is the reminder that we just have to stay with it, and we can't develop this sort of racial equity fatigue. I'm looking in the mirror when I say that, just thinking about making sure that our commitment to bringing about a dismantling of systemic racism is steady, it's continuous, and it isn't one of those things where we just say, hey, remember back in the summer of 2020 when we did that Black Lives Matter thing? It just can't be that. And for me, and I think for a lot of us, we're just trying to be steady in the work and trying to make sure that we do our part to make sure that this work is meaningful and that we contribute as allies to something that is long overdue. So again, it's at Teach for the Culture on Instagram. Would really encourage you to give that account a follow. Another great follow is Holiday Phillips. Holiday is on Twitter, she's on Instagram, she's on Facebook. And I'm not really sure exactly how I came across Holiday's accounts, but there was just something about not just the message around racial equity and systemic racism and how we can really sort of do this work in a substantive way. It was how the message was delivered as well. Just everything about it just resonated with me. So I really would encourage you to follow, again, Instagram, it's at Holiday Phillips, Twitter, it's at Holiday Phillips, Facebook, Holiday Phillips. The most recent post that caught my attention was this one, where she writes, and it was a reminder to herself, but it was important, I think, enough to resonate with everyone, which is to stay in the struggle for social justice without burning out. You must protect your mental health and cultivate your mental flexibility. And, look, I could spend 30 minutes going on and on and on about everything I've learned from her. And I've learned a tremendous amount over the last, number of months and last number of years. As an older white guy trying to figure out, how I can be a more substantive ally on a day-to-day basis is the work that, I'm trying to invest myself in. And I know a lot of you are as well. So, like I said, you won't be disappointed if you follow Holiday on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. I think she primarily uses Instagram for most of her posts, but again, you'll have access to all of that content. I just really would encourage you to follow her, and I think you won't be disappointed. You'll really hear a message that is both important, but you'll also hear it in a way that is actually replicable and in a way that invites us into the conversation and brings her perspective to the table. So, like I said, don't waste any time. Go and follow those accounts at Teach for the Culture and Holiday Phillips. You won't be disappointed with either of those. Okay, that's going to do it for episode 1 of the Tom Schimmer Podcast. Remember to follow the podcast Twitter account for updates on the show. It's at Tom Schimmer Pod. My personal Twitter handle is at Tom Schimmer. Also, please remember to email me your questions for Assessment Corner. Send those to tomschimmerpod@gmail.com. Next week, my guest is going to be Anthony Muhammad, and we are going to take a deep dive into the racial equity work, both within schools, but also society as a whole. So you won't want to miss that. Again, thanks for joining me this week. Please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. Have a great week, everyone.